All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for our May webinar on funding EV projects. We're really excited to have you here today, especially with some recent developments in grants being released. So excited, kind of opportune timing for this webinar, and glad that you could all join us. Our agenda today is we have two wonderful speakers, Cassandra and Julie, who are here to kind of give both the Michigan and Ohio perspectives on funding opportunities and what's being done, as well as kind of a general overview of funding opportunities that are available and what we as communities should be doing as we think about going after and applying for these different opportunities that are available. There will be time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So as always, there's two methods to share your questions or comments. You can either put it in the chat and then I can vocalize that. Otherwise, if you feel comfortable with coming off mute and asking the question yourself, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And then, as always, at the end, we'll have a couple announcements and next steps before we sign off for the day. For our welcome and icebreaker, I would invite everyone, if you haven't already, to change your Zoom name to include the community that you're representing. Just that gives people a good idea of where you're coming from and can give context for questions or whatnot. And then in the chat, if you would like to respond to the following question, it's kind of a multi-part, so bear with me, but it's, have you applied for funding for an EV project? And if you have, what funding source did you go after? And if not, do you plan to? So while people are changing your names in your Zoom names and responding to this question, I'll give people a few minutes to do that. I see some movement in people joining the call. So we'll give everyone a moment before we jump into our wonderful guest speakers today. Oh, it looks like people are currently planning to apply, and Summit County went after CFI round 1 and hoping to go after round 2. So that's great to hear. We do have some information about that today for you. Great. Well, I want to introduce our guest speakers. The first speaker we have is Cassandra Clevenger from Power a Clean Future, Ohio, followed up by Julie Staveland from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. So thank you both for being here today. We're starting off with Cassandra. So Cassandra, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you share your screen, and then we'll just jump right into Julie's presentation after Cassandra has presented.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk a little bit about navigating the federal funding ecosystem, and fair disclosure, I have an environmental background, so I like to equate things to ecosystems and nature, but ecosystems are complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. We operate them. There's a lot of systems within the larger system. And I think it's a really nice analogy for the environment that we work in when we think about braiding funds and community capacity building and really addressing challenges and challenges that are entrenched in some of our systems in our community. So just a quick introduction. I'm Cassandra Clevenger, and I'm the Deputy Director of Power Clean Future Ohio, and we work with local communities to really think about the clean energy economy, really around climate change, and what are all of the other pieces of that too? What are all the other intersections of that? We really work, again, not to kill the word intersection, you're going to hear that a lot today, but we really work at where we can save communities money, improve the quality of life for our residents, and create a healthy environment. And when we can achieve all of those goals. We call that a win-win-win. And that's really at the heart of where we provide community recommendations. So why am I presenting on a transportation chat? Well, I'm sure as most of you are aware, transportation as a sector in general is one of the highest emitters. And that's definitely the case in the state of Ohio, where, targeting emissions from the transit sector, it saves communities money because they're not paying for fuel. It improves the quality of lives for residents because it cleans the air and creates economic opportunities. And then that healthy environment piece too, clean air. Everybody wants clean air. We want clean air. So what are the things that we can do to help communities reduce their emissions? And how do we help them look at this issue, not just beyond climate and climate change, but mitigating that with the idea of the community vision in mind, and then also thinking about how we can use that to build resilience overall. So for today's presentation, I'm going to run pretty quick because I want to leave some room. We have a small group, would love some conversation at the end here so we can dive a little bit deeper. Sometimes I feel like you get more insights from folks' questions and such. But I wanted to chat a little bit about challenges and opportunities communities face when applying for federal funds, and then kind of speaking to this idea of looking at it as an ecosystem that we're all operating within with a common goal to create a healthier community, a more livable community, a walkable community, places where people want to work, live, and thrive, right? And then what are some next steps that you can be thinking of? I also have Rebecca alluded to it a little bit, but we've got a wonderful announcement. Community fueling infrastructure grants have finally been announced. And I also have some insights that we gained from a couple of the projects that were awarded in Ohio in the last go around with that. So speaking a little bit to challenges and opportunities, I think there's a lot of challenges in this space, but in working with communities throughout the state, being a grant writer myself who's worked in coalition with organizations that range in capacity from totally volunteer and donation ran organizations with small budgets to foundations that are granting millions of dollars a year, I see some of these issues pop up as themes overall in general, no matter what group or space that I'm working in. So focusing in on the capacity to apply for and implement the grant is a huge challenge. Another challenge that we see people pop up and that pops up in people face is that the project costs more than any one federal grant program can fund. Again, we're working in very complex systems and environments, so that pops up a lot. Projects in those places have really big price tags, and a lot of times one funding source won't get you to whole there. And then building in long-term project and program sustainability is a really big challenge that people face. I like to take challenges and turn them into opportunities. It kind of shifts the mindset, shifts the frame of mind to think, okay, well, we have these challenges, but if we address all of these challenges, we end up with a really strong and competitive application because the pathways to address these challenges, again, address capacity needs, get us to whole on the project budget, and promote long-term sustainability in the projects. So it really comes down to building collaborations, and I don't want to go as far to say coalition because that's kind of a loaded word sometimes, but really thinking about those collaborations and the different ways that you can work with stakeholders in your community and thinking about your community in a 360 view. That gives you the capacity to operate in complex bureaucracies. If some folks know how to navigate USDA funding, some folks know how to operate, I'll say Department of Transportation funding. Some folks know how to work in some of these different systems, and you're coming together as a team. You can work towards addressing some of those capacity gaps and knowledge because you have a lot of combined knowledge over the bureaucracies you're operating in. thinking about project cost, it gives you an opportunity to braid funding, to think about philanthropy in the situation, to think about new opportunities for collaborations with different funding sources, thinking about how you can utilize state, federal, and philanthropic, well, I'm not going to be able to say that, philanthropy to push forward your project budget to reach whole. And that long-term sustainability comes from engaging with your partners and making sure you're taking that 360 approach. If folks see that a program or project is working and it's increasing the quality of lives and it's doing what it was intended to do because it was designed collectively, it really leads to being able to scale projects and move them forward and show long-term viability of those projects. So thinking about the federal funding ecosystem, I sent over some materials for Rebecca to send out afterwards that these graphics are part of, and you also get this presentation. These are some of the folks that are providing federal funding for climate action, specifically thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Each of these folks fund climate action in their own and unique ways, but it shows how if you have an issue in your community, such as climate, such as transportation, thinking about all of the different components of that project and the different ways that you can fund pieces. So, for example, there's funding for upgrades from Department of Energy for our electrical grid and different pieces there. How does that spring off of the work that's happening with vehicle charging and coming from the state and the federal government and such? It's challenging to navigate on your own, and that's really why you need a team. But if you know who's funding things, they are fantastic at providing office hours and listservs and information on programs where if you go to grants.gov and just use that as your resource, it can get very confusing because it's just the NOFOs listed out, and it's a great place to start. But also these departments are a wealth of resources. U.S. Department of Transportation has a guide on braiding federal funding sources to meet local match and how you're able to do all of those different things. So within these departments, there's a lot of institutional knowledge. So just knowing where the ecosystem is a great start. But for the purposes of transportation, really looking at DOE and U.S. Department of Transportation, obviously, but for auxiliary projects like thinking about urban forestry programs, those come out of USDA, right? So it just, the money flows, but how does it flow into the community? On top of that, you have an ecosystem working within your community of businesses, nonprofits, local governments, NPOs, schools, and universities. This is only a small variety of partners. It really goes even beyond that. And I've provided some different ways that they can play a role on projects in your community. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward a little bit further so we can chat a little bit about, I believe I have CFI in here next. So we had a notice of funding opportunity announcement for community fueling and infrastructure grants. It just came out yesterday, so very exciting news there. I haven't gotten a chance to dig into the NOFO too deep for this round, so I'm going to post in the chat for you all the info sessions coming up. Oh, maybe I'm not. It seems like it might have froze. There we go. There's some info sessions with the United States Department of Transportation coming up specifically on this program, so I wanted to make sure I highlighted those. I think CFI is really, and what we've seen, oh, I didn't mean to do that. This is the page for that program too, just to give you guys a quick program overview. If you click the, in my presentation, if you click the image, it'll take you to that announcement. But moving forward here. Successful CFI applications in round one were really collaboratively structured. We saw businesses coming together with nonprofits, local governments, schools and universities, And of course, we had to add another partner with this one where there were site host partners because there's a site host component to this. So again, being boots on the ground in your community, knowing the objectives of the businesses and the nonprofits and all of the different stakeholders you have in your community can help you create projects in which you can identify funding that matches the project, rather than some folks think about the funding first and try to work the other way, where you should really have a project and a vision and move in the other direction. 2 awards came out of competitive CFI applications in round one. One went to NOACA, which is our Northeast Ohio Area Coordinating Agency. That's our Metropolitan Planning and Transportation Planning Organization here in Northeast Ohio, serving Cleveland and Greater Cuyahoga County and a couple other counties in their footprint as well too. And we saw an award go to SOPEC, which is a council of governments that also serves as an electricity aggregator. We have community choice aggregation in the state of Ohio. So they also provide those services to their member communities. That being said, those organizations and institutions alone didn't craft those applications entirely on their own. I know the Southern Ohio application really started rumbling out of communications with local governments that they wanted to see that program in their communities, and expanded from there, where they were able to bring multiple stakeholders in. And now, instead of just serving the original community that the CFI grant team originally was thinking about, that brought the opportunity to the table, which was the city of Athens, here in Southern Ohio, we now, that project expanded from the city of Athens and their corridor all the way to the city of Dayton, which is on the other side of the state. So it connects Southeast Ohio and Southwest Ohio with electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which I think was a really cool opportunity. But the city of Athens had an idea that they wanted to bring this program to their community, but they didn't. I don't think they would have been able to take that as far as it did and make it the competitive application that was awarded at the end of the day, without all of those other partners connecting and making it reach a scale that is competitive. So thinking about that too, and thinking about that capacity piece to reach scale, to be competitive for some of these federal opportunities. So yeah, multi-city applications were carried higher awards. There were projects at all scales, so you did not have to go for the maximum request in round one. Thinking outside of the box and considering not only the scale of projects now, but how can projects be scaled up over time. And I think when you have those different partnerships coming to the table, you can paint that picture in a way that is more explicit than if you were just applying on your own. The recruitment of partners into the application was challenging. I see folks having an easier opportunity here because people that are resubmitting or looking at retooling their applications are a little bit further along in the process. I think also in CFI round one, a lot of folks were caught off guard with the opportunity. And now that folks have been planning for the opportunity for the last year, even if you didn't make your application in round one, folks have been thinking about what round two looks like. And we've anxiously been awaiting this announcement. So again, very exciting to hear this as well. So just thinking about next steps, what are some of your next steps to make this happen? I covered a very, very, very complex idea in 20 minutes. I think every time I do this, the right time for this workshop is probably closer to 3 hours. So we can really get in the nitty gritty of what do capital stacks look like, and what is braiding versus blending of funding, and how do you actually take the vision, identify the partners, and move it to the next phase. But I just wanted to leave everybody with some next steps, and that having one-on-one meetings, Zoom has made this even easier than it has been in the past, but just to check in with stakeholders to see if they're interested in collaborating. Folks might be having the same challenge. Folks might not be even aware of the opportunities. And until we have conversations with each other, we really don't know what each other's doing, what each other's long-term vision is. We really need to break down the silos that we operate in and think about what cross-sector collaboration looks like to solve challenges like climate change, like transportation access, like healthcare access, all of these really complex challenges that are within complex systems. I mentioned listservs earlier, huge opportunity there. Not all listservs are created equally. I know it can be very, very overwhelming when you go to, say, EPA's website to sign up for their listserv. There's like 30 or 40 different emails you can sign up for. One of my favorite ones from Department of Energy is their weekly Jolt. It's News for Clean Energy Champions. I think it has the best selection of webinars out of all of the Department of Energy newsletters that I've seen. But there's also some other good ones out there. So I would recommend don't subscribe to everything all at once. It will overwhelm you. But thinking about learning a little bit more about the offices within the departments for the programs you're interested in, doing some research in that avenue and figuring out what listservs you could subscribe to is very valuable when you're looking for opportunities. The climate programs portal also has some wonderful examples of funded projects that have been funded previously, funding opportunities that are coming down. It's all climate related, but climate's a very intersectional issue. So there's lots of transportation information on there as well too. And I'm speaking to government officials right now, but sometimes this slide is for other folks. We encourage folks to talk to their local government officials and specifically residents and within communities and the folks that a lot of these programs and projects, it's their tax dollars. It's there to help them. So having their input on these things is really important, but we can't expect local governments to be able to go out and do that. So encouraging that back and forth where residents feel like they can communicate those things to their local governments, businesses, nonprofits, all of the folks that are within that ecosystem. And I would say host a community networking event or try to attend community networking events, also being mindful of the capacity issue. Just being out in the community, getting other viewpoints, you can really learn a lot about what's going on and where folks' minds are, so that when we're building projects, we can think about the co-benefits of those projects and make sure that even if the main project doesn't seem obvious that it benefits, being able to know the co-benefits of those projects so we can and where the challenges of our residents lie so we can communicate those co-benefits and so folks are aware of the opportunities available too through the work that their local municipality is doing. I also would also add that sounded a little goofy. I would also add that sign up for our newsletter. We send out a newsletter every 2 weeks. It is very Ohio centric, but one of the cool features of our infrastructure grant assistance program that we provide to our local governments here in Ohio that are member communities is our grant snapshots. And they're one pagers that, well, usually 1 to 4 pagers. Some grants are really complex, but they're fact sheets about grant opportunities so that you can do a quick scan of things to get an idea, to communicate outwardly with other partners you might want to collaborate with. I think that's been really helpful. It kind of takes some of the pressure off of them where you're not asking them to read a whole NOFO to see if they would be interested in participating in a program with you. You can use those fact sheets as a communication tool. So if you use the QR code, you can sign up through our newsletter. It also takes you to the website. We post all of our grant snapshots there, but we update our newsletter every 2 weeks with our new ones. My contact information is there as well. And yeah, I think I used most of my 20 minutes, but thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Cassandra. That's great. And as you mentioned, I will be sending out the worksheets and the additional information that you provided along with the slides to the group. So they'll have access to that after this webinar. And so without further ado, I would like to pass it off to Julie. Julie, thank you for joining. And you should have sharing capacity or
Yes.
capability.
Sorry, it's more of the technology we use Teams, so Zoom I'm a little slower.
Oh, I feel that it's like opposite for Teams versus Zoom.
Yeah, 100%. So, should be able to see it. Did I do it right?
Yes. Although right now I think I'm just seeing the I don't know if you have it in presenter mode yet.
Mm,
There we go. You
there
got
we
it.
go. I did it. Gold star for the day. Happy Friday, everybody. So thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. Julie Staveland. I am the Assistant Division Director for the Materials Management Division at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, otherwise known as EGLE. I'm also the State Energy Office Director. We are the designated State Energy Office for the Federal Department of Energy in Michigan. So I'm going to come at this from a little bit of a state's perspective rather than focusing just on the funding opportunities to kind of talk about how we here in Michigan have approached the transition and electrification of our vehicles and the planning that goes into that. So just a little bit of background on where we are at in, oops, too slow, too fast. To give you kind of like a little bit of background of like what my area covers. I oversee energy, recycling, and pollution prevention programs. These are grant and technical assistance programs that all, of course, work towards the goals that are outlined in the My Healthy Climate Plan. And our funding comes from a variety of sources, both state funding as well as federal funding from the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, our Volkswagen settlement dollars, and new this year is our U.S. Department of Ag funding that we have. So when we design our programs, we kind of focus on kind of 5 key areas or our 5 pillars. Communities and schools, the agriculture, small business, rural business, and small manufacturers in our industry, ensuring equitable access to renewable energy and recycling, and of course, clean transportation, and then workforce development. So for all of the programs that we have and funding that we pursue at the federal level, they all typically fit into one of these buckets. So today we're talking about clean transportation, electrification. So I want to go over kind of some of the key projects that we've got going on here in Michigan. And these have really been in the works since 2018, 2019. And the stimulus funding that, has come through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, and some of the other initiatives have really kind of, it feels like, been fortuitous in how we've kind of designed our programs over the years. So back in late 2017, early 2018, we knew that EVs were coming, right? But electric vehicles require a different level of infrastructure than gas stations, of course. So we had our Volkswagen settlement dollars, which we had a certain percentage of that we could dedicate towards EV infrastructure. But we wanted to make sure that we were investing those dollars to the fullest extent and leveraging them so that we could have essentially a network that could get us from Detroit to Houghton or Marquette up in the UP for worry-free EV travel. So we did a grant with Michigan State University to essentially do the research and identify those nodes throughout the state that would give us a bare bone structure, right? Where, how far apart can we structure these nodes based off of travel patterns, based off of weather and how it impacts EV charging? What would this look like? So the optimized EV charger placement plan essentially gave us a map of where we should invest our funding from the Volkswagen settlement dollars to install the direct current fast chargers or the DCFCs, as well as level 2 chargers. So we use that to essentially design the layout for our Charge Up Michigan program. So once we had the map of where these charging nodes should be, we worked with our local utilities, our communities, the EV industry, as well as other entities throughout the state to design a grant program. This is Charge Up Michigan. Essentially, it's based off of a 1/3 model where the state puts in a third of funding, the utility puts in a third of funding, and the site host puts in a third of funding to essentially build out the EV infrastructure for the state. While this is also going on, we wanted to provide assistance to local governments as they look at updating their planning and zoning documents. So we worked with the University of Michigan to essentially catalog all of the zoning ordinances within the state of Michigan. We have 1,856 jurisdictions to identify which communities had considered, we were looking at a couple of different things, renewable energy such as wind and solar, but also EVs in their zoning ordinances. And then also be able to identify, is it supportive of that technology? Is it limiting of that technology, or does it not mention it at all? And so we were able to catalog all of those jurisdictions within the state, and we have a free database that's available online. The idea behind this is twofold. One, so that developers can see what communities basically are open for business, depending on what technology they were looking at and what's kind of ripe for their area for development. And two, for local communities within the state to see with their peers who's doing what. So if a community hadn't zoned, say for EVs, then they could look at a community that has, see how that community structured their zoning ordinances, see what they like, see what they don't, and be able to share some of that peer learning across the state. We also conducted a local survey of all of our local jurisdictions. We wanted to see kind of what the baseline was of where our local governments are at. It's an energy survey, so it covered everything from energy efficiency to renewable energy to education with your residents, as well as electric vehicles. And the one that was interesting was, of course, related to EV policies. So we did this study twice. We did it in 2019 and we just reran it in 2023. So 2019 was our baseline that really kind of set the stage of like, okay, here's where our local governments are at. Again, 1,856 jurisdictions. This is run through the University of Michigan through one of their amazing departments, and they have an over 70% response rate of local governments that participate in this. So these numbers are pretty comprehensive of the majority of our communities in the state. So in 2019, only 6% of communities had even looked at EV policies or had adopted EV policies, right? And 61% hadn't even thought about it. So we use this information at the state level to say, okay, well, we need to put a little bit of work in terms of the education and outreach that we're providing at the state level in terms of guidance that communities can use in their planning. And so we reran this in 23 and we saw a slight uptick. So it went up to 13% of communities that had considered EV or adopted EV policies. And the not considered at all went from 61 down to 56. The dark blue on the bottom, those are for communities that, depending on how they answered earlier questions in the survey, they didn't even really consider energy as part of their planning within their community. We see that a lot in some of our smaller communities. This is useful for us because we use this to figure out our programming in subsequent years. So I want to highlight some of the what work that we've done through Charge Up Michigan. So we've invested about a little over $20 million in EV charging stations throughout the state. We've got over 276 stations that are online, and of the funding that we have available, we've still got a little over $1 million left that we're working on deploying chargers, mostly focusing on the UP right now. We saw that was tended to be a little bit of a harder area for us to get some chargers in. Some of that's due to the infrastructure that's there, as well as demand and resources that are currently available, but that's our current target for that. In terms of other programs, the progression of Charge Up Michigan transitioned into the Lake Michigan EV circuit. This is a partnership with the states, of course, around Lake Michigan, where it's an EV tour basically around Lake Michigan, and what would those stops look at? So this is a partnership where we were looking at how we could network EV chargers, across the 1,100 miles of shoreline around Lake Michigan to kind of try and incentivize adoption of EVs and going on this great tour around the lake. So we actually just closed our recent round of applications for the Lake Michigan circuit. Those applications have been scored and we're waiting on approval to start issuing those awards. So those are going to start to be coming out later this summer, and then we'll most likely be opening up a round 2 for additional funding for the Lake Michigan EV circuit as well later this fall. The other 2 programs that we have that are relevant to vehicle electrification and then EV charging infrastructure is, of course, the fleets themselves. So we have 2 programs. One is through our VW funding, the Volkswagen settlement funds, and the other is through EPA's diesel emission reduction funding. So both of these programs look at targeting some of those bigger diesel vehicles that use the more fuel and that are traveling across the state, and helping transition those to either cleaner, more efficient diesel or even no emission to electric vehicles. So we've had these go throughout the state. The the clean diesel program is currently open right now, and we're accepting applications. And that's really looking at transitioning those heavier duty fleets over to electric vehicles. And then, of course, you can't have EV infrastructure without a grid, right? And making sure that the grid can handle that increased capacity need that electric vehicle charging requires. So we also have our grid funding, which is through the Department of Energy's grid resiliency formula funding that the state has applied. And this is essentially for grid hardening and grid upgrades in order to handle this increased capacity. The other one that's kind of exciting is hydrogen funding. So hydrogen hubs are starting to get a little bit more attraction, at least here in the Midwest, but across the country as well. So the transition from internal combustion engine to fully electric is easier for light duty vehicles, right? There's an easier transition and the batteries are, pretty comparable to what a normal gasoline vehicle will use. When it comes to the heavier duty vehicles, it's not as easy as a transition because those batteries are so heavy, it's not as efficient. So the middle ground in between the traditional combustion engine and going electric is the hydrogen fuel cell. And so with the stimulus funding that has come out, the Federal Department of Energy has invested some funding to try and kind of leapfrog the hydrogen industry so that this transition can be made a little bit quicker. And so earlier this spring, the Michigan Infrastructure Office, or MIO, partnered with some entities on a proposal that the DOE had on hydrogen hubs. And we were selected for funding, and they're currently under negotiations. And so we're looking at rolling this program out most likely this fall. We're shooting for October. And this will result in the build out of a hydrogen hub truck stop and then hydrogen fuel cell trucking vehicles that'll be available as well. We see this as kind of a pilot program, but this is kind of what's going to be happening in the next 5 to 10 years in this industry as we get to that technologies that are able to handle, the greater, heavier vehicles for that long trucking distance. And then the other thing that I want to mention that we try to do from the state's perspective is really provide resources for local governments, right? It's not just the planning and zoning. There's other things that communities can do, local governments can do. You have different tools that you have available, but finding them all in the same place is sometimes hard to find. So in Michigan, we developed the Catalyst Communities Initiative. This is essentially a multi-tiered approach to kind of identify the 9 key areas that a local government has control over through their local government's rules, ordinances, and planning that all can contribute towards sustainability and resiliency and going toward the climate friendly planning. And so these are free resources that are available for local governments that kind of break down each of the areas. Not only resources and tools on what they can do for these different areas, but also who's doing them and where are the guides. So, we know that here at Eagle that we're not the only experts. We partner quite a bit with our Department of Transportation or Department of Health and Human Services, as well as universities and other entities across the state and across the nation that have great resources and access, and try to have it as like a one-stop shop where communities can go to find more information, as well as learn from their peers. We do webinars regularly highlighting how different communities in the state are doing one thing or another as they fall under each of these categories. And then these are live, streamed online, they're recorded and posted for future viewing. And we also do workshops and targeted cohort learning as well, tackling kind of each of the different areas. Because one of the things that we know is that as local governments, right, you guys are dealing with so much stuff. You wear so many different hats and you might not all have the same resources. So really trying to break it down into bite-sized pieces that's easily digestible for communities so you can come back to it when you have time and figure out how to basically crack the nut on sustainability. And then, so when it comes to where to start and what your next steps are, I kind of broke it out into 3 main areas, right? First, you got a plan. You really need to figure out where you want to go as a community. What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? How do you want to figure out this whole electrification process with, electric vehicles and EV infrastructure? So there's lots of resources that are out there, and figuring out kind of where to start is often hard, sometimes the hardest question. So using some of the existing information that's out there that identifies, okay, where do you start? And then look at your zoning and ordinances. What can you do within your local government control to really affect change? One thing that we look at when we look at parking lots, right? Costs money to get that redone. They have to be redone in every certain time. But if you plan in a way that say, okay, if this parking lot's going to be redone, then you have to make sure that it's future-proofed for EV installation when it comes. You don't necessarily have to put the EV charger in right there, but you could make sure that it's set up so that when the EV infrastructure needs to come in, the parking lot's already prepped for it. And that saves, almost 2 times the cost of having to redo the parking lot to incorporate the EV infrastructure. So looking at those things and then looking at, study your ordinances and how you work with your local businesses. Are they designating a certain number of key spots for EV, electric vehicle owners that are in the area, or, how they're planning that out? And then the other kind of middle ground is connecting, right? You got to have that networking and that stakeholder engagement and outreach. For EV infrastructure and electrification, you got to talk to your utilities, right? They're the ones that are making the plans on their grid improvements and their prioritization. Cassandra, you're not the only one that can't talk today. And so, when they are looking at their grid, they're looking several years out. So if you're talking to them and say, hey, look, we want to identify where we want to put these chargers, where does it make sense within our jurisdiction? What do we need to know? And the utility can be aware, okay, we know the local government wants to put chargers here. These are the investments we're going to need to make sure that there's enough power going to that location, right? So kind of that back and forth dialogue to really have a good relationship with your local utility. And then also talking to your local businesses and schools. What are their plans? I know that EPA just announced their recent round on electric school bus funding that came out. Those electric school buses are going to need to be charged. Where are they at within your jurisdiction? Where is the utility pairing with them? And how does that factor in? And then same for your businesses. What are their plans? How do they view it? Do they want to help promote it? Are they looking at adopting electric vehicles? Where are your high profile areas, if it's a downtown district or a tourist area, that you want to, have that investment and try and drive traffic to those areas? And then as Cassandra had talked about earlier, is really looking at those funding opportunities and trying to have kind of your project outlined and identified on what you want to do. And then when the funding opportunities are available, you're ready to go right after it. And then also connecting with your utility and local businesses will also help you with those funding opportunities too, letters of support or project details. And then of course, it's time to implement. This is where, it's a great opportunity for local governments to lead by example, right? Looking at your own fleets. How can you electrify them? How can you install EV chargers? What does it look like? Being fluent in how the electric vehicle infrastructure network works so that when your residents are coming to talk to you, you can have that conversation with them and provide some of that education and outreach as well. And then of course, thinking outside the box. You don't have to do it exactly how some other community does it. What works for your community? What works for your residents? And that was all I had. I just wanted to open it up for conversation because it's a great opportunity to talk and answer some questions. And then I did include links to our different resources as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. That was very informational. I have one quick question for you to give people some time to think about their questions. So everyone think of your questions and then right after mine, we can get to yours. You mentioned for the Catalyst Community Initiative that there's a lot of resources. Are those resources available to anyone?
They're on the website. I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. So you have to have internet access. But yeah, these are open and available for anybody. Right now, when we're looking at, of the 9, our energy efficiency and renewable energy is really fleshed out. We focused on that one first. Right now, we're working on our materials management one. There's some resources under the mobility and water are 2 for this year that we're working on, and then wrapping in some of the other ones. This is kind of a multi-pronged approach that we're taking for these. But yeah, there's tons of resources, lots of webinars, recorded information, FAQs, handouts, links to other communities, feel free.
Right. It's slight follow-up because I recognize that it's Michigan focused, but we do have some Ohio folks on the call, and I'm just wondering if, like, to save them time, do you think it would be applicable to
Sure.
Ohio communities as well?
Yep. Yep. I mean, the basics are the same, right? The process. It'll just be kind of the community examples and what's allowable within Ohio, right? Because depending on what your codes might be, or, you know, if it's local rule or, you know, whatever. But overall, the best practices are based off of national standards. So we just tried to give, like, here's the best practice, here's what the process is, and then here's a Michigan example is typically how we try to do it.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be quiet with my questions now and open up the floor to anyone on the call who has questions for either of our presenters today, or even for each other.
I did have one other thing that I forgot to mention that I didn't put in my slide, so apologies. In terms of funding opportunities, the thing that we have done differently this year is typically we have a grant program that's designed for local governments. It's called our Community Energy Management Grant. But because of the stimulus funding that's come out through the Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grant, EECBG, we've added that, and the component that we've added into that is it is allowable to do EV infrastructure, so like the EV chargers, fleet electrification, as well as you know, conservation of transportation energy, so like non-motorized planning, as well as, you know, light poles and everything too. But I just wanted to mention that we have that available and open right now too.
Great, thank you. Do we have any questions from the group? Oh, I'm seeing Ava from Sterling Heights says, do any cities require new gas station developments to implement EV infrastructure?
That's a great question. I don't actually know of any cities off the top of my head that have that as a requirement. But that is something that a city could put in when you know, if a gas station's coming in for a permit, if the city had something in their, you know, permitting requirements that would require the gas station to also plan for electric vehicle infrastructure, that's one way a community could do it.
Well, I'm not sure of any cities that require it either in their code. The first NEVI charging station in Ohio is at a gas station. Those public-private partnerships, those site people are very critical in this. And I think they have a financial incentive to do some of this work themselves too. So you know, even before you get to the point where you write it down in policy, having conversations with those folks to talk about how you want to see that in your community. And, you know, I think there's an opportunity there to incentivize it as well too.
Just in case people aren't looking at the chat, Ryan, also from Sterling Heights, said we partnered with a private company to install EV chargers on public land, but DTE, their power provider, has held up the process. Any advice?
Send me an email. Let me see what I can do. Here, I'll put my- Yeah, because I know they follow a process. I know that they're constrained sometimes in how many projects they're allowed to do in a given year. So I don't know if there's a backstory to why they're holding it. But I can help you navigate that.
Well, and I think, Julie, that just does underscore the importance of working and talking with your utility and having those conversations, especially as you're planning for installing infrastructure, to say, you know, are you at your project limit for the year or whatnot? And so keeping them apprised can be really helpful. I have a question for both Julie and Cassandra about, and my question is, so for applications that you do see that get funded, what's like, a few things that make them really successful? Cassandra, I know that you kind of mentioned the scope of projects and having multiple partners is helpful, but are there any other insights you can give?
You can go first, Julie.
So it depends on the project. So when we're looking at the EV infrastructure, we're looking to see, did you check with your utility to make sure that your site is appropriate for bringing power, right? Because different chargers require different levels. Think of like in your house, you can't just plug a dryer into any outlet, right? It requires a special outlet with a certain power draw. EV chargers are the same way, right? So we look at that first. Second of all is, have you considered the longevity of the project, right? If you're the site host, that's awesome, but not everyone is a site host, right? So they might be partnering with that gas station or with someone else. What is the long-term agreement for the operation and maintenance of that EV charger? Have you thought big picture on some of that stuff? So looking at, how well thought out the project is and who you've talked to partner on some of that stuff. When we're looking at the vehicle electrification, are your costs realistic, right? Because different models, are different priced. And so do you have a quote? Do you have a model that you're looking at? Do you have charging infrastructure for that electric vehicle that you're going after, either already installed or you're going to be going after that as well? So again, kind of that look at the big picture. Those are kind of the primary things that we're looking at. It's just, have you considered all the options? And we don't mind helping provide some of that guidance as well. So when, you're looking at funding opportunities and you have questions, talk to us. We're happy to answer questions.
I can speak in a more general sense around NOFOs in general, the Notice of Funding Opportunities that the federal government puts out from various departments. They're long, complex, and tedious documents, sometimes upwards of close to 100 pages. There's a lot of legalese and contract language that's very important to review, but isn't necessarily important to getting the application over the finish line. It's a lot of regulations on how to operate, and some of it is I don't want to say rubber stamp, but some of it's similar from department to department. There's differences, minor, like maybe around procurement and programs and things. There's minor differences, but for the sake of this conversation and for the sake of figuring out where to even start when you approach that document, there's three things that I'm looking for. What needs to be in my actual application? What are they looking for in the narrative? What are all of the bits that they need for me to prove that this project is awesome and deserves federal funding and is checking all the boxes? What am I allowed to pay for and how do I pay for it? And how can I reimburse and how do the financial mechanisms of the grant program work? And lastly, I'm looking at that competitiveness criteria. Programs will express what they're looking for within that competitiveness criteria, and you can identify what you need to be focusing on that. So I'll give an example. It's not a transportation related grant, but community change grants are about grassroots stakeholders and community change, community benefits plans, engaging with your community around really big projects to solve really big, wicked problems. That grant, if I'm a statewide organization looking for federal funding or a state government or something, I might not be looking at that grant opportunity because I know in the competitiveness criteria, I'm not going to be competitive there. Whereas something like a local government working with its NPO to go after a charging and fueling infrastructure grant, that checks those boxes, of some of which that Julie mentioned around what they're looking for when it comes to competitiveness at the state. And I would say a lot of the things line up between the state and federal level. They're looking for a budget that makes sense, that you've done your due diligence to make sure once you're awarded funding, you can do the project, engaging with your utility, engaging with site holders, all of those things. So to sum it up, that NOFO really outlines what the competitiveness is in that program. And you can kind of see whether or not you would be whether you should even take the time to put the grant together, or maybe you need to go back to the drawing board and strengthen or build more elements out in your projects. Don't recommend trying to fish for funding. I recommend having a solid project and finding funding that matches it. But as you're resubmitting and retooling, it's great to bring in more stakeholders and make projects stronger. So I hope that summer catches some of your points that you were hoping to catch, Rebecca.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or message me, and I can get them to our speakers. And I do see that Jacob just put a great resource in the chat, and that does lead me to I have just a few wrap-up slides here as we're almost to the top of the hour. Once again, I think our speakers covered it so well, but as a reminder, CFI round 2 is open and the closing date is August 28th. But if you had a previously unselected applicant or application, there's a different process that you can request via email that is you need to do by July 1st. And Cassandra already put some of the webinars that the DOT is putting on as a part of that. Some other resources, I think Jacob put this in the chat, but CFO did a great webinar about preparing for round 2 and some lessons learned that would be really helpful as you're going forward with any application that you're planning. Additionally, the Electrification Coalition has a hub for CFI tools and resources, along with kind of a general EV funding finder, which is really great. It's very user-friendly, as well as one thing that we didn't really talk about today, but I did want to provide it as a resource about elective pay for any electric vehicles that you might be purchasing. And I will put those links in the chat shortly, as well as sending them out in a follow-up email. The last thing that I wanted to chat about was just to give you a heads up that we're going to be starting a verification process where a part of this program is that you can get designated as a Charging Smart community. And so I will be sending a follow-up email to you all individually about kind of the process for that. So just keep an eye out. It will be a pretty simple process. It'll just require you looking at a spreadsheet that I'll send and adding any information about work that you've done or that you're planning to do. So as I mentioned, keep an eye out early next week for an email from me about that. And then our next webinar is at the end of June 28th, I believe it is, at the same time. So as always, if you have any questions, need support, are thinking about this CFI opportunity and you would like support from us, please reach out. I have some of our emails on this next slide, but let us know how we can support you. Or if you have questions about anything that we talked about today, feel free to email me. So it looks like that was perfect timing. Thank you to our speakers, Cassandra and Julie. That was such great information and resources that you shared, and I will make sure and get that out to our participants who are here today, as well as those who couldn't join us. So thank you so much, and everyone have a really great weekend, and we'll see you in June.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.